Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, a fascinating SEC matchup. South Carolina heading on the road to play Kentucky week 2, and it went back and watched the Southern Miss game for Kentucky. And I'll say this, I get it's about 2 quarters and a half of takeaways. This Kentucky offense looks a little bit different with Brock Vandagriff. And I think Brock Vandagriff probably has to do a better job of, towing the line in terms of being a difference maker, but also taking care of the football. This kid brings a lot more juice to this Kentucky offense than Devin Leary did last year. Then you look at South Carolina, we're going to get into, some significant question marks we have about the South Carolina offense, but I'll start with this. This South Carolina defense, it's legit. And one of the things we talked about most with South Carolina during the offseason was, can they get some sort of pass rush going? It was a disaster rushing the passer last year for South Carolina. They certainly are getting it going. And I think Dylan Stewart might be the best of the bunch. I think he probably is right now, the best true freshman that we see in the country. And so South Carolina on defense presents some challenges to this Kentucky offense. We still have question marks about this South Carolina offense itself, though. We're going to get into it before we do. And as always, though, number one and most importantly, would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. The best part about doing these game predictions is whether you agree with me, whether you disagree with me, whether you disagree with the pick. The best part is talking ball with you guys in the comment section. So let it fly in the comment section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's get into this one. I want to start with what I think is probably the most fascinating matchup in this football game, the Kentucky offense going up against the South Carolina defense. Now, let's start with Kentucky's offense. Brock Vandagriff, you can tell why he was a five-star prospect coming out of high school. This kid, in terms of arm talent, is extremely dynamic. There's not a throw that Brock Vandagriff cannot make on the football field. I felt like at times against Southern Miss, might have been trying to do a little bit too much, but at the same time, you brought Brock Vandagriff in to be a difference maker. Like, you kind of have to live with him trying to make some of those big time throws and towing the line a little bit. I think Brock Vandagriff can be a difference maker in the Kentucky offense. And if you get him towing that line the right way in terms of, hey, I'm going to make the big time throws into tight windows, but also keep the football out of harm's way, this is a quarterback that you can win a lot of football games with. I think you have elite pass catchers on the outside. Not enough people talk about this Kentucky wide receiver and guys like Dane Key and Barry and Brown, but also adding a guy like Jamori Macklin in the transfer portal. Brock Vandagriff has a lot of wide receivers that can do different things in this Kentucky offense, right? Barry and Brown, one of the most purely explosive players with the football in his hands. Dane Key, extremely physical at the catch point. Jamori Macklin, probably the best all-around wide receiver that Kentucky has, but all three of these guys can operate in different situations and do different things really well. And so I look at this Kentucky offense and say, again, when it was against Southern Miss, we didn't really get a full 4 quarters. Brock Vandagriff in these weapons, I'm intrigued. And what Brock Vandagriff can do with his legs, I'm getting some gamer vibes from Brock Vandagriff. And what I mean by gamer is this kid's going to do what it takes to win football games. I'm not sure if you got that from Devin Leary in 2023. You're going to get that from Brock Vandagriff, kind of like we talked about with Brady Cook in 2023 was at Missouri. Did it always look pretty for Brady Cook? No. But he was a guy that always seemed to get the job done and move the chains and put points up on the board. Brock Vandagriff is a very talented quarterback, but he also has that gamer about him that I think is really exciting. Now, you look at South Carolina's defense, suddenly the secondary looks a lot better with a good pass rush. I'll start off with saying that. We kind of talked about it in the offseason. I think a lot of the critiques on the secondary should have been more towards the pass rush for South Carolina. I think the South Carolina secondary, obviously getting their hands on football, is forcing turnovers, but this pass rush it's elite. I mean, Dylan Stewart, one, is just so physically gifted as a true freshman. But more importantly, like as a pure football player, as a pass rusher, this kid knows what he's doing and can win outside the shoulder, can win inside, can win with some speed to power. A wide variety of pass rush moves that Dylan Stewart put on display in his first ever collegiate football game. That was about as impressed I've been with a true freshman. And we kind of said it all offseason, like this kid can play and is going to bring a lot of juice to this pass rush. Kyle Kennard, Georgia Tech transfer, he looked really good. TJ Sanders on the inside, we kind of knew what he was. I think the biggest story for South Carolina is I think this defense is going to keep them in the football game. Now, the biggest question for South Carolina in terms of how good they can be in the SEC is what is this offense going to look like? And I guess that's a nice segue to get into the offense. LaNorris Sellers, 10 to 23 for a buck 14. Didn't look that comfortable, at least in my opinion. I know a lot of South Carolina fans would probably agree with that take. And I think outside of LaNorris Sellers, the offensive line I still have question marks about. And you saw a little bit of Tree, saw a little bit of Josiah Thompson. You can tell this South Carolina offensive line is still trying to find not only the best five, but I think a little bit more chemistry. I mean, in terms of picking up some blitzes and stunts, they kind of look lost. We're late getting to some assignments, and that certainly didn't help LaNorris Sellers. And in the run game, it wasn't great either. It wasn't like South Carolina was physically imposing their will on an Old Dominion team, which doesn't bode well for looking at that Kentucky matchup where you're going to have to try to block guys like Deion Walker on the inside. And so, as of right now, and I think a lot of South Carolina fans would probably agree with this, this offense looks quite one dimensional. Like, I don't think there's a ton of confidence in LaNorris Sellers to be pushing the ball down the field. I don't think there was any difference makers, guys that really impressed me at the wide receiver room. And so I think the South Carolina offense is going to be very run centered. Now, my question is the offensive line good? Like, hey, I know LaNorris Sellers is a very good athlete. I know Rocket Sanders, when healthy, is a very good running back. They have the pieces to have a really dynamic and effective run game. But you got to have an offensive line that can win at the point of attack. And I don't know if we saw that for South Carolina week one against Old Dominion. And I think the question is, if they can't do it against Old Dominion, what makes us think they can do it in SEC play? Now, the one caveat to this, and I think the bright spot for South Carolina is I think this unit only gets better. Like, this is still an extremely young unit that has guys that are true freshmen or second-year players on the offensive line combined with a couple of guys that are new to the offensive line through the transfer portal. So I think this unit can get better. I'm not ready to just kind of throw them out and say they're going to be bad all year, but it certainly wasn't kind of what we were looking for week one against Old Dominion. Now you look at Kentucky's defense. This Kentucky defense, it's going to be just about as good as we've seen Mark Stoops have. And Coach Stoops does a phenomenal job with defenses, quietly, kind of consistently has top 25 units. The front seven's really good. The secondary is really good too. And I think the biggest X factor in this game is, can South Carolina block up Kentucky and get this run game going? Like, when you talk about guys like Deion Walker or Weaver or Silver or a guy like Dumas Johnson, I thought was huge for this Kentucky defense at the linebacker spot, specifically in this kind of matchup against South Carolina where there's going to be a lot of read options. Your linebackers are going to have to be disciplined with their eyes. A guy like Dumas Johnson has been an all SEC, all American caliber linebacker at Georgia, and you can tell that this kid has played a lot of football over the last couple of years because he's consistently in the right spot at the right time making plays. I think Kentucky, I don't know if they were kind of missing this piece last year, but Dumas Johnson seems to be the glue that is holding this Kentucky defense, not holding it together, but kind of bringing it together. I think Dumas Johnson had a phenomenal game, and I'm really high on him heading into SEC play. And then you look at the secondary and say, we think the secondary is going to be really good and kind of matched up against these South Carolina wide receivers. Can Kentucky just kind of load the box, stop the run, and kind of leave their defensive backs on islands? Because I don't know if South Carolina showed you anything that you're kind of fearing what South Carolina can do in this passing attack. And so kind of getting into the pick, and it sounds like I'm low on South Carolina. Maybe I am reading too much into a week one performance against Old Dominion. That being said, I think a lot of South Carolina fans are in the same boat. South Carolina is going to have to play significantly better if they want to go on the road and beat a Kentucky team that is very solid top to bottom. And so I think the big keys to this matchup is, one, can South Carolina get the run game going? Because I think that's going to be when this offense looks the best. And then on the defensive side of the football, can they force Brock Vandagriff into some turnovers? Because, again, Brock Vandagriff is going to be a quarterback that's a little bit of a gunslinger. He wants to be a difference maker. He's going to make some high-level throws, but he's also going to put the ball in harm's way a little bit. And so if South Carolina wins this game, it's probably going to be on the back of this defense, specifically this pass rush, getting after Brock Vandagriff and forcing some turnovers. But getting into this pick, you look at Kentucky sitting at 9 points right now as the favorite. I'll take Kentucky because I think this is a tough matchup for South Carolina where they're going to want to try to run the football on the road here. I don't know if they can against this Kentucky front seven. And I think you look at the South Carolina offense and say if they can't run the football, I don't know if I have a ton of confidence that they can move the football consistently. And I think Kentucky has the difference makers on offense, headlined by Brock Vandagriff, to put up enough points. I'm going to go with Kentucky. I'm not selling my stock on South Carolina. This was a team that I thought was really fascinating if LaNorris Sellers could be a difference maker. We haven't seen that yet. And so I think the South Carolina team can be dangerous when you have a quarterback like LaNorris Sellers. But right now, you see a little bit more of a complete team for Kentucky than you do at South Carolina. So I'm going to take Kentucky, 9.5 points. We'll lock it in. We'll close it out on that. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.